All right. So tonight we're going to finish chapter 2 of Philippians. And this is our last class of November. Just to give you an idea of where we're at, only 3 more weeks, and then we'll be done with Philippians. So hang with us for 3 more weeks through the end of the year. Tonight, we're going to continue chapter 2, like I said, finish it up. And I think it's important to remember that we're reading a complete letter. This letter was not intended to be broken apart and read a few verses a week like this. So every time we talk about a section of it, try to think about it as part of the larger whole. Everything that we read is related to what we read last week and the week before that. So I'm going to try to highlight a couple aspects of that this week. And the first one is the first word that we'll talk about this week, the first word of verse 12. This is a really strong correlation word. It's almost as strong as cause and effect. So remember last week we talked about the example of Jesus emptying himself, humbling himself to the point of death on the cross, and then God exalting him. And then when Paul goes into this exhortation, how he introduces it is he uses this word, which basically means because of this or as a result of what Jesus did, and then the exhortation. So as a result, my beloved ones, just as you have always obeyed, not only in my presence, but now much more in my absence, with fear and trembling, work out your salvation. For God is the one who works in you to will and to work according to his pleasure. So the basis of what Paul is telling them to do or telling them how to live is what we saw Paul describing Jesus doing last week. And another thing that these two little verses kind of recap is something we saw in chapter 1. So just to point out a couple of things, remember Paul said, live as a citizen worthily of the good news of Christ, so that whether having come and having seen you or being absent, I might hear things concerning you, that you are standing firm in one spirit, one soul, competing together for the faith of the good news, and not being petrified in anything by those opposing you, which is to them a demonstration of destruction, but to you of salvation, and this from God. And then what we just read, so then, my beloved ones, just as you have always obeyed, not only in my presence, but much more in my absence. So Paul again is hitting on this theme of whether he's there with them or absent from them, he basically expects the same thing from them. And then this idea of fear and trembling, work out your salvation. And what he said earlier was standing firm in one spirit, one soul, competing together. And that word, if you remember, it has the same root as our word athlete. So it's like striving together, working together for the faith of the good news. And then verse 13, for God is the one who works in you to will and to work according to his good pleasure. Earlier he said that their salvation is from God. So salvation is a work of God. So all these same themes he's saying again, but in different words. Verse 13 sometimes is a little bit controversial as a verse. It's the idea that God is the one actually working in us. Where's human agency or where's free will in that? And I think we have to read this in the context of what we just read. So what we read last week with Jesus, so Jesus emptying himself, humbling himself, but then God was the one working in him to glorify him and to exalt him. So I think that's what Paul is talking about here. God is the one that's doing the work to exalt us. We are actively humbling ourselves, submitting to God. God is the one working to exalt us. God is the one working out our salvation. So it's interesting that the two words, the salvation, he talks about in verse 28 of chapter 1, and then again, verse 12, he doesn't want us to forget that salvation is from God. It's the work of God, but we also have a part in submitting to the will of God and working that out in our life. So that's just to highlight a couple of things, a couple of themes that Paul is repeating. And this also serves as the prelude to the exhortation. So before he actually tells them what he wants to tell them, he has this little introduction. And then he says, do all things without murmuring and disputing, so that you may be blameless and innocent children of God, unblemished in the midst of a crooked and distorted generation, among whom you shine as radiant lights in the world, presenting the word of life unto a boast for me in the day of Christ, that I did not run in vain, nor grow weary in vain. So their obedience that Paul just mentioned, as you have always obeyed, their obedience, and furthermore, their obedience without murmuring and disputing, is what makes them distinct. So that's what sets them apart as children of God in the midst of this blameless, in the midst of a crooked and distorted generation. So they're blameless and innocent, unblemished. That's language that you use for a lamb, a sacrificial lamb in the Old Testament. So they're this blameless, innocent being, and they're surrounded by this crooked and distorted, corrupt generation. And the distinction is so strong that he says that you shine as radiant lights. And this word only occurs one other time in the entire New Testament. And it's in the context of Revelation 21, talking about the New Jerusalem. So this idea of shining as radiant lights in the midst of this corruption distinction, it has this idea of the Philippians being sanctified, being made new creations by grace and by their salvation. And so they're standing out from their cultural milieu as much as the New Jerusalem stands out from the Old Jerusalem, or as much as new creation stands out from old creation. So it's in Revelation 21, there in verse 11, it's describing the holy city, the New Jerusalem, coming down out of heaven from God. It shone with the glory of God, and its brilliance was like that of a very precious jewel, like a jasper, clear as crystal. It had a great high wall with 12 gates, with 12 angels at the gate, and on the gates were written the names of the 12 tribes of Israel. So I just throw this verse up here to highlight that Paul is encouraging and exhorting them to this radical distinctiveness among their location. So all the way back, thinking of week 1 in this Roman colony where emperor worship is the main religion, Paul wants them to be as distinct as the new creation coming down out of heaven. This image is from a 14th century tapestry. This idea of this is the New Jerusalem. This is John over here getting the revelation. So it's an interesting image. And then this conclusion, but even if I am being poured out as a libation or as a drink offering upon the sacrificial altar and ministry of your faith, I am glad and rejoice with all of you. And likewise also you be glad and rejoice with me. So Paul's death is always in the background of Philippians. We talked about that earlier, that for him to live is Christ, to die is gain. So Paul's death, I think because of his situation in prison, is always in the background of what he's writing to the Philippians. So here he says this idea again, even if he's poured out, or even if he dies upon the sacrificial altar, so if he's like a sacrificial lamb dying for the faith, he's glad and he will rejoice. And he says that they also should be glad and rejoice with him. So what Paul is encouraging them to do here is to adopt the same perspective that he has of even losing your life for the faith is something to rejoice in. And again, what we talked about last week, Jesus humbling himself, to the point of death on the cross. So that is the paradigm for Christian life, Christian service, is humbling yourself to the point of death. And Paul is doing that by his life, by his ministry. Paul is exhibiting that. As we talked about last week with the Philippian jailer, Paul humbled himself to the point of death, and that's what brought about the change in the jailer. So that's the paradigm. I think maybe we should have started by reading what we read last week and then letting it just flow into that, because this really is, this exhortation is a continuation of what we read last week. And then Paul moves on and he talks about two people. So he talks about Timothy and Epaphroditus. Both Timothy and Epaphroditus, I think, are given as examples for the Philippians to follow. And they're given as personal examples of people they would have known. So Paul says in verse 19, "Indeed, I hope in the Lord Jesus to send Timothy to you soon, in order that I also may be encouraged, having known the things concerning you. For I have no one same-souled who will genuinely care for the things concerning you. For all those seeking the things of themselves, not those of Jesus Christ. But you know the proven character of him, that as a father-child relationship, he has served with me in the good news. Therefore, I hope to send him so that I might see the things concerning me immediately. But I am persuaded in the Lord that also I myself will come soon." So Paul is telling them he's going to send Timothy so that he can hear from Timothy the things that he's already heard about them. And he's telling them that Timothy is the closest thing that they're going to get to Paul until Paul himself comes. This word that I translated as same-souled, isopsychon. This actually, Brother Schramm will appreciate this. The word isotope, mean same place on the periodic table, comes from this Greek word iso, which means same, and psyche means soul. So Paul is saying that he and Timothy have their souls in the same place. They're completely aligned. And that's the kind of unity that Paul keeps talking about, with having the same mind as that of Christ Jesus. What Paul wants them to do is to have their minds, their hearts, their souls aligned with Christ. And again, what we saw last week, what that looks like. It looks like emptying yourself, humbling yourself to the point of death. So Paul is telling them Timothy is like this. And he says that he has served with me, or he has been a slave with me in the good news. So Timothy is a servant like Paul, like Jesus. And then Paul is expressing this hope that he's going to come again. So I think that's important, is even though Paul is thinking about his death, that's always in the background of what he's saying, he still expresses hope that he can come. So Paul's death is not this thing that's just weighing him down. Philippians is known as this letter which talks about joy. Paul just said, "Be glad and rejoice, even if I am being poured out as a libation upon the sacrificial altar and ministry of your faith." So in the face of death, Paul can still rejoice and be hopeful because he's submitted his life to Christ, because he's emptied himself, and he's allowed God to exalt him. So I think that's important, to hold on to the source of Paul's hope. And then Paul mentions Epaphroditus. And we'll learn in chapter 4 of Philippians that Epaphroditus is the one who brought the gifts from Philippi to Paul in prison. And now Paul is sending Epaphroditus back to them. So likely Epaphroditus is the one who actually carried this letter that we're reading back to Philippi. And this is, Paul says that he is sending him. So verse 25, "Now I deemed it necessary to send you Epaphroditus, my brother, fellow worker, and fellow soldier, and now your messenger, and the minister of my need. So the minister of my need, is probably referring to the help that the Philippians sent to Paul. And this, your messenger, indicates that Epaphroditus carried a message from Philippi to Paul in prison, and Paul is responding to that in some way through this letter. Verse 26, since he was longing for all of you and being deeply distressed because you heard that he was ill, for indeed he was sick, nearly to death, but God had mercy on him, and not only on him, but also on me, in order that I should not have sorrow upon sorrow. Therefore I have sent him more hastily, in order that having seen him again you may rejoice and be less anxious. Therefore receive him in the Lord with all joy, and hold such men in honor, because he came near to death for the sake of the work of Christ, having disregarded his soul, so that he might fill up your deficit of service toward me. So what likely happened was the Philippians sent Epaphroditus to Paul with a message and a gift. And while Epaphroditus was there with Paul, he got sick and he almost died. And the Philippians heard about this and were worried about Epaphroditus. And even though Paul needed Epaphroditus for encouragement in prison, he wanted to send him back to Philippi for the sake of them. So I think this is just another really small example of Paul's attitude. So he's alone in prison. Epaphroditus comes to visit him, and rather than being selfish and wanting Epaphroditus to stay there with him to encourage him, Paul would rather send Epaphroditus back to Philippi with this letter so that the Philippians can see him again and rejoice and be less anxious. So that says a lot about who Paul is, how his spirit was transformed by humbling himself, submitting to Christ. And then this verse here at the end, Epaphroditus came near to death for the sake of the work of Christ, having disregarded his soul. So soul here doesn't mean his spiritual soul, like he was throwing away his soul, but it's like his personal inner wishes, desires. It's like he was throwing away or disregarding his own interest for the sake of the work of Christ. So Epaphroditus, very explicitly here in verse 30, is pointed to also as an example of self-emptying, of humbling himself literally to the point of death for the sake of the work of Christ. So that's what I've got for this small little section. 2 examples to follow, and 2 examples which emulate Christ that we saw last week. And this brief exhortation, which really flows out of what Paul said last week. So become like Christ, and then this is what you do. You obey without grumbling and complaining. And then if you want to know what that looks like, look at Timothy and Epaphroditus. They're examples of that. All right, does anyone have any comments or thoughts, questions? It's good to see Benson and Tiga. So if you're talking, you have to unmute yourself. There you go.
Jackson.
Yes.
So I think it was verse 13 when your first slide. Yeah, verse 13, it talks about good pleasure. Is that just to emphasize the degree of pleasure? I mean, because it seems like all pleasure is good.
Yeah, that could also be translated according to his good will. So, or to his goodness. So what God is working in you is according to his goodness or his goodwill.
Hey, Jackson.
Hey,
Hey, that last verse there, just curious, or maybe Eric would know too. The word translated soul.
yeah,
What is that in Greek?
soul. Are you talking about the last verse here?
The last verse there, 29, I
Yeah,
thought,
30.
30. Is
So
it
this
pneuma?
no, this is psyche. So this is just the standard word for soul.
Okay.
It's the same word.
So translating.
So how is that
Standard
translated?
word. Is there a more specific word for soul
No,
or
that's
spirit?
spirit is a different word.
Okay.
Pneuma is spirit. Soul is used almost sometimes like personality. It's like it's how we use spirit sometimes. It was it's more than just like your soul that's being saved in salvation. Your soul is
Right.
your inner your heart, almost like your heart and soul.
Okay.
Yeah. But yeah, sometimes it's a little bit frustrating. Like these words are used so generally in some cases, and then they've like a word like soul has got this huge religious connotation for us, and it seems like sometimes Paul uses it without that connotation, because it doesn't make sense that Epaphroditus would throw away his soul for the sake of the work of Christ. Like that's the whole point of the work of Christ.
Is it more like it almost has the appearance of disregarding his life,
Yeah.
as opposed, in the way I think of that.
Yeah. And that's true. Like really soul and spirit are really closely related words. Even more so spirit, if he had said disregard his spirit, that would really have the connotation of his life, especially if this was the Old Testament, because in the Old Testament, the word spirit is the same word as breath, like the breath of life is the spirit of life. So yeah, maybe it is something closer to that, like disregarding his
That's
own
why I was wondering,
life.
was it the word pneuma
No.
used there?
Yeah, it's a different word here.
Okay.
Jackson, this
Yes.
is Sarah. Would it be correct to say that that word "psyche" is where we get our English word psychology or psyche?
Yes, it is.
Okay.
Yeah. See, all of you already know so much Greek. You could learn Greek so easily.
That was the joke in Bible school. It's all Greek to me.
Yeah. That was the name of my first year textbook. Does anyone else have anything? Well, I appreciate everyone coming out for class again. Like I said at the start, only 3 more weeks. So stay strong for 3 more weeks and we'll get through this long letter to the Philippians together. All right, everyone have a good week. I'll see you next Sunday.
Okay,
Thank you.
sounds good. Thank you.
Hey, Sarah.
Hi, Susan.